Hi there, folks. This is Tom, and back here again with you for the Week 13 recap with the heavily biased top 10. Bring on Rivalry Week. So, what do we have on tap this time? We're going to talk about the conference races. We're going to get in a little bit of You Played Who. We'll get through the heavily biased top 10. We'll talk conference rankings and a little bit of predicting the Week 13 college football playoff rankings. As a little bit of bonus content, I know this is a little bit of a short turnaround week with several of these games being played on Friday here during the rivalry week, but we'll do a little bit of blind resume. My goal is to try and put out a couple more of these when we get to both the rivalry week primer and a bit as we get into the conference championships and kind of talk about determining those last few spots in the college football playoff. So as bonus content this week, we'll do some blind resumes and we'll talk about kind of how those work. Take a look at them here at the close. So let's go ahead and dive on into conference races. First up, the probably least impactful unless something kind of weird happens, and that is going to be the ACC. Virginia, Pitt, SMU, and Miami are the teams still alive for the conference championship game. Virginia and SMU, along with Pitt, are teams that have only one conference loss. Pitt is behind the other two in tiebreakers. And so Virginia and SMU are both winning in. Pitt would need a win, and that would mean beating Miami. Pitt would need a win and have either of Virginia or SMU lose. Miami would both need to beat Pitt and have both Virginia and SMU lose. So they need a lot of help, which is interesting because here is a Miami team that is largely being looked at as the best team in the ACC. And so a team that is still kind of fringe contender, very much alive in parts of the picture for the college football playoff, but has a very, very limited shot at making it into the ACC field. And so that would be an interesting spot just because the ACC right now, I think, has been very stuck on just one team in the field and has been for quite some time. So it would be interesting to see how this one plays out and kind of where they go. Miami also, if we remember, our history from this season, has a direct win over Notre Dame. And so this is a team that either the games matter or they don't. And we have to look at the context of the whole season to say that Miami is probably one of these that we really need to pay attention to as we go down the stretch. Georgia Tech has been eliminated from ACC contention. After their 8-0 start, they are 1-2 in the last 3 games. And because of the tiebreakers, that means that they are out of the competition for both the ACC and really the CFP. They could get a big bump in kind of how their ranking looks should they beat Georgia, but that's not going to be enough to propel them into a college football playoff. Big 12. Texas Tech and BYU are in control of their own fate. These two have games against a 4-7 West Virginia and a 5-6 UCF, respectively. They are not the only two teams that are alive. Arizona State and Utah have very narrow windows to reach the championship game. Each one of those requires Texas Tech and or BYU to lose, and then to kind of have a little bit of help. But the weird part here is that Utah has consistently been the higher ranked of those teams. They are not the more likely candidate to make the Big 12 championship game if there were chaos among Texas Tech and BYU. Barring some kind of oddity, we expect that the conference championship game is likely to be a rematch of the Texas Tech BYU game that Texas Tech very well controlled. And if we have a repeat of that same kind of performance, we would expect that this is also a one-bid league. Big Ten. For quite some time, the top pair have been Indiana and Ohio State. Due to the nature of who they are playing, Indiana has the slightly both of them are very likely to make the championship game, but Indiana has the slightly higher probability. They are playing one of the worst teams statistically in all of Power 4 football, which is to say that they are taking on Purdue. They make the championship game with a win. With a loss, there can be some oddity happening, though a little bit less so for Indiana than for Ohio State, because the other one-loss team right now is Oregon, who Indiana beat. You would have to have a multi-team tie at that spot for Indiana to maybe not make the conference championship game, and that would require an Indiana loss and an Ohio State loss. Really interesting quandary, really an impossible task, seeing as how Ohio State has lost 4 games in a row to Michigan. A Michigan upset of Ohio State would put Ohio State out of the Big Ten championship game. However, seeing their ranking currently and kind of where they have been, I don't think that would propel them out of the top 4, which makes for this really interesting bit of gamesmanship. I know that this is not a game that Ohio State is going to throw and lose. I'm intellectually aware of that. But at the same time, what's to stop them? Go out, play, look good, just don't quite piece it together. A Michigan team winning that game would mean Ohio State gets to sit the next week from the conference championships. It would mean that they would likely get a bye, and so get an extra couple of weeks worth of rest going into the playoff. You've got a couple of receivers that still look a little bit banged up. You don't look quite like yourself. Hey, look, a month off to rest these guys up. It's not going to happen, but it is the oddity that's there. It would also probably propel a 4th Big Ten team into the playoff. I've had the Big Ten kind of diminishing their playoff odds over the last few weeks. And the likelihood of them getting 3 in is a foregone conclusion. The likelihood of them getting 4 in is a little bit diminished. And so this would really change that math a lot, and would likely propel a 4th Big Ten team into the playoff, barring other problems. The SEC. So Georgia has finished their SEC schedule. They are sitting at 7-1 and are awaiting the results of several of these games. Texas A&M, as we have discussed for a couple of weeks now, still needs to beat Texas. They have played a conference schedule that is kind of below par with the rest of the teams who could be 7-1 in the conference, and so would likely fall back in any sort of tie-breaking situation. That said, they definitely have some tie-breaking losses should they lose to Texas, because Georgia have a head-to-head win over Ole Miss, who if the tie was a 3-way, 4-way at 7-1, head-to-head, Georgia's beaten Ole Miss. Common opponents, Georgia's beaten Texas. Georgia would squeeze out Texas A&M. Texas A&M winning in, or have both Alabama and Ole Miss lose to Auburn and Mississippi State. Alabama, there's about 4 different ways that they could make the championship game. None of them happen if they don't beat Auburn. And let me tell you, from the perspective of an Alabama fan who has watched this matchup over and over again over the course of my time, playing a night game in Jordan-Hare is not exactly the thing that I want to see. That place is cursed. And you can ask a lot of the SEC that, and they're going to tell you that place at night in November is cursed. I've watched enough football to remember Auburn being the best team in Auburn in November, followed by Auburn being the worst team in Atlanta in December. They beat both Alabama and Georgia in some last-second plays, and went to the SEC championship game where they played in Atlanta, lost that game decisively, turned around and played the Peach Bowl in Atlanta, still within the month of December, and lost that as well. And so they were the best team in Auburn in November and the worst team in Atlanta in December, as the Falcons played 2 home games and won at least one. Um, Georgia. Georgia needs Alabama or Texas A&M to lose. If Alabama loses, Alabama drops out of the picture, and then it becomes a 7-1 at worst between themselves and Ole Miss, and they have the head-to-head win. If it's Ole Miss and Texas A&M, as kind of discussed, Georgia has played Texas and beat them. Texas A&M, well, they're playing Texas this week, and if they are going to get to 7-1, that means losing to Texas. Ole Miss would need a 3-way tie with Georgia, Texas A&M, and themselves, which means that they need a loss for both Alabama and Texas A&M. That particular scenario would put Ole Miss into the conference championship game for the first time and would rematch them against Georgia. A lot of buzz this week, as there is every single time November rolls around, talking about the SEC and playing FCS games late in the year. This is a tired trope. This is something I have seen, especially as we have moved from a BCS into a 4-game championship series, now into a 12-game playoff. That I have seen that progression of talk for a long time, talking about the SEC playing a down game in November. The reality is that 119 out of 134 FBS teams will play at least one FCS game. That is 88.8%. Roughly 1 in 9 do not. But here's the trick. They usually play them one end or the other of the schedule. If the only thing that matters to you is when that happens, then you need to understand how conference scheduling works a lot better. Because the reality is that in the first playoff field, every single team in that playoff field had played an FCS opponent. In the last several iterations of the 14 playoff, maybe a half dozen for the entirety of the 14 playoff didn't play an FCS team. It's been a while. I didn't do that much digging on that one, but I know that happens all the time. And the champions almost exclusively did because, well, a lot of them are Alabama. A lot of them are Clemson. And I know that those teams play an FCS team in their schedule. So here's the trick. When it happens shouldn't matter. Because if you are complaining that it happens at the end of the season, instead of opening up with somebody that is a lower caliber opponent, what are you doing? Oregon started off the season with Montana State. Ohio State, albeit having a game that moved off their schedule, played Grambling in their second game. Several teams opened up with much lower class opponents as far as their classification within the strata of college football. They played FCS teams. For 119 of 134 to play them, that doesn't mean that the SEC, with only 16 teams, had this happen. As a matter of fact, there were 4 SEC games this week. So you're not talking about something that happened in isolation. The Big Ten almost exclusively plays Big Ten games once their conference schedule starts. Show me the spot where somebody could squeeze in and play a Big Ten team late. Same thing with the Big 12. They play exclusively Big 12 games once their conference schedule starts. There's just not the spots to move that in. The ACC. The ACC adjusts their schedule a little bit. They, like the SEC, have had 8 conference games for a long time, and it's very difficult to slot them somewhere before the last week because they try and finish up their conference schedules either with the rivalry games or to finish them out as Georgia Tech has or Florida State or Louisville and play the rivalry game in the final week. Other realities. Put yourself in the hat of a team in the MAC. It's a big deal for you to play a bowl game. It's a big deal for you to be 6 wins, 7 wins every year. Teams that have a over-under at the start of the season of 5.5 and are looking from a year-to-year perspective of getting that 6th win. Do you want to go try and get that on the road at Vandy in Game 11, where you are sitting on needing 2 wins to get to the end? It's just not going to happen. And so when you play that game does not matter. And it's time for people who have played FCS opponents to stop talking about when it happens. So who you've played also has to matter. And what we haven't seen so far is that play out in the CFP rankings. Notre Dame has a head-to-head loss to both Texas A&M and Miami, 2 teams that actually have smaller chances than others in their conference to reach the championship games of the SEC and ACC. In reeling off 9 wins, Notre Dame has played the last place team of the ACC. Actually, they played the bottom pair. They played the last place team of the SEC. They played the last place team of the Big Ten. These have a combined record of 8-36. I am not impressed to see you roll up 70 points on Syracuse. I'm just not. That's a bad team. Yeah, you had a magical start, and sometimes that's going to happen. It is way, way outside of normal that you're going to score 21 points before your first offensive snap. But, once every few thousand games it'll happen, considering that they've probably played nearly a couple thousand games not quite that, 1,500 or so games in Notre Dame's lifetime of playing football. You might have that happen every 500 or so. But to call the anomaly anything other than that is a fallacy. You played a bad team, and you played a bad team that had a terrible, terrible, terrible start. Sure, you rolled up 70 points. Okay, who wasn't gonna? Which team of a decent caliber wasn't going to against that kind of start? The reality is that this is a team that doesn't have a major win propelling them to the position that they're in. And they're held above a couple of teams that do. When we start looking at numbers, we're not going to include them this week, but we will, or we're not going to include them in this particular video, but we will later this week. All right, heavily biased top 10. Ohio State regains the edge for me at number 1. It's an FBS win. Texas A&M didn't play quite the same caliber of opponent, whatever. But overall, the metrics do slightly favor Ohio State as a result of that, and so they take that number 1 spot. Texas A&M number 2, Georgia in at number 3. Georgia's been my number 3 for a couple of weeks now. 7 P4 wins for Georgia, 7 Power 4 conference wins, are 44-33. Indiana, their 8 P4 wins are 43-45. Indiana's number is going to get worse this week because they are going to play Purdue, one of the worst teams in college football. Georgia is going to play Georgia Tech, a team with 9 wins. So a 2-9 team on Indiana's schedule, a 9-2 team on Georgia's. These disparities aren't going to flip. Georgia number 3, Indiana number 4. Texas Tech in at number 5, Ole Miss 6, Oklahoma 7. Here we've got the volume of Power 4 CFP ranked wins. And really there's some merit for including them ahead of Ole Miss. But we'll get to those as we get to things a little bit later on this week. Volume of ranked wins, head-to-head over Alabama, who I've got at number 8. Again, Alabama is in that spot because the volume of Power 4 CFP ranked wins. They are not ahead of that spot because they are locked behind Oklahoma right now. Number 9, I have Oregon. And number 10, I have Notre Dame. There's a very good argument that could be Miami based on head-to-head. These two share the same record. Yeah, Miami struggled against some other weaker teams than Notre Dame lost to. But in doing so, they still have a better P4 record than Notre Dame does. Again, we'll try and look at that this week. Conference rankings. The SEC adjusts up a little bit this week. I've got them at 4.6, which is to say that I expect the SEC to have a fifth team in. I've given them a better than about a 60% chance of winding up with a fifth team in the playoff. The Big Ten, I have them at 3.2. The Big 12, 1.4. The ACC, I've got at 1.2 because I still think there is the possibility that if Miami beats Pitt, some things could happen. You could wind up with some teams kind of shuffling around, have some weird losses here and there, and suddenly you've got a Miami team that's making the playoff field. G5 has their obligatory spot, though right now you have several teams that are really pushing for that. And then Notre Dame, who plays another team that's going to wind up 4-8. And 60% chance to make the field. That accounts for all 12 playoff spots. And I think that we're headed towards we're probably headed towards one of these situations where that's a 1 for Notre Dame, a 1 for G5, probably a 1 for the ACC. I do think that it's likely to be 1 for the Big 12, 3 for the Big 10, 5 for the SEC. All right, let's predict the college football playoff rankings. 1 through 5, no change. They didn't play games or have results that would fundamentally change how they are sitting. As a result, I think this is still going to be Ohio State 1, Indiana 2, Texas A&M 3, Georgia 4, and Texas Tech 5. Based, again, kind of on who they played and what was going on, I think that you're going to see the committee move Ole Miss to 7 and slot Oregon in at 6. We'll discuss that one when we talk rankings later this week. We're definitely going to have a second version of the podcast this time. Notre Dame at 8, defying any explanation. They hammered the fourth worst team in Power 4. Somehow that's better than beating a now 7-4 team, 17-6. And I think they slide up and take the 8th spot away, moving Oklahoma to 9. Alabama stays at 10. BYU, Miami, and Utah round out the top 13. I didn't go beyond that because the likelihood of somebody outside of that, other than a conference champion, is quite small. But that's kind of where we stop here. So I promised you a little bit of bonus content. Let's do one good blind comparison here. What we do in blind comparisons is that we take some teams that are we take their resumes, we take the names off, and we give you things based purely on their merit. And I'm going to ask you to think about these, take a look at them by their metrics and figure out who you think should be ranked ahead of the others. Team A. Team A has Power 4 victories with a record of 49-28. Their total schedule, which I will always exclude FCS, their total schedule is 171-50. Is 71 wins against 50 losses. This team controls their own destiny in conference play, and they have a top 10 victory. Team B, their Power 4 victories have a combined record of 48-51. Their total schedule right now has a record of 64-57. They also control their own destiny in their conference, and they do not have a top 10 victory. Team C, their Power 4 victories have a combined record of 42-35. Their total schedule is also 71-50, as is Team A. They control their own destiny in their conference, and they do not have a top 10 victory. And so looking at these resumes, we are trying to figure out which team should be ranked ahead of which other one and kind of where these three should fall with respect to one another. I know who these are. I wrote the resumes. I wrote the resumes based off of their actual records and where these three teams sit right now. And let's kind of talk our way through them and feel out where we are. Team A has a Power 4 record of the teams that they have beaten that is 21 games above 500. Now, you can look at the other two and you can figure out that they haven't played the same number, or say they haven't won the same number, um, because we're only representing 77 games there. So 7 P4 wins. Versus Team B, who is looking at 99. They've played 9 P5 games, or they've won 9 P5 games because people have 11 games right now. Team C, again, 42 and 35. They have a similar number of victories by their defeated Power 4 opponents. However, a big disparity in their Power 4 victory percentage. So the teams they have beaten have been, some of them have been a lot better than others. The total strength of schedule is kind of similar, because we have two teams that have played schedules that are 71 and 50. We have another that's played a 64 and 57, so they're a little bit lacking. All three control their own playoff destiny as far as getting into their conference championship game. So all three are in the top of their particular conferences. Only one of them has a top 10 victory. So if you hadn't figured it out, I will tell you who these are in a second. But when we look at these resumes just on blind totals, yeah, we can tell that Team A has some losses, probably. Just because they haven't played the same volume as everybody else has, or haven't had the same volume of wins as everybody else. In respect to Team B, Team C probably has a loss as well. Just because, again, the volume's not there. We're talking 99 games in the record for Team B, and we don't have that same volume for either A or C. But when we take record out of the mix and we look at kind of who they have played, A and C both have stronger schedules. Not by worlds stronger, but while all three have a above 500, A and C have significantly stronger schedules because they're 7 victories up, and a total of 14 games difference, with a 21 game swing between their wins and losses for teams A and C, and only a 7 game for Team B. The other thing here is that, top 10 victories. And so, yeah, you've got only one of them has that big signature win. Ranking them with respect to one another can be very difficult. As a result of this, if we had taken out and just given you the victory percentage here, that clearly would have fallen with an advantage to Team A, because they're going to have a slightly larger lead over Team C, and then Team B has a sub 500. These three are currently ranked 10th, 1st, and 13th because they are Alabama, Ohio State, and BYU. Is that where each of these should be based on blind resume? I would say no. You probably looked at this, and if you really dug deep, there's a chance that you ranked this and looked at just the number of wins and tried to figure that out. But if I even remove that one and I give you just their percentage, you clearly rank this as ACV. So always looking at merit, always looking at kind of where we go. Yes, we have to kind of take into account wins and losses, and losing games should matter. But there is a big, big gap between who you've played. And I think that one of the things that we're going to see play out in committee this year and in the next couple of weeks is to try and determine how that matters and the messaging that that's going to send of, do you Look, if you didn't like the FCS games now, and the messaging becomes very clear that who you play does not matter, just as long as you win your games, forget it. You're going to see a lot of teams that go out and schedule as many FCS schools as they can and as few Power Four opponents as their conference allows them. But that's the reality of where we are. So we're going to be back kind of in the midweek this week. We'll do a very brief primer for this week because it is rivalry week. You're pretty sure who you're playing. And I've already showed you how some of the conference scenarios play out, so we know who many of the big games are already. But we'll do some more blind resumes this week, and we'll talk about them in ways that try and compare some of the teams that are most likely to be factors in the college football playoff. So we'll see you later on this week. Have a great day, and tune in later on for the primer and some blind resumes.